As I sit here in our quaint coastal town in Maine, the salty breeze wafting through my open window, I can't help but reflect on the strange turn my life has taken. My name is Lisa Harris, and at 22 years old, I find myself back in the place I've always called home, though it feels different now. The familiar streets and faces that once brought me comfort now seem to hold secrets and whispers I can't quite grasp. It's been 3 months since I graduated college, 3 months since my world came crashing down around me, and 3 months since I returned to the arms of the one person who's always been there for me, my grandfather, Richard Harris. Our town is the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, or at least they think they do. The seasons here are as predictable as the tides, with short, vibrant summers giving way to long, harsh winters that seem to isolate us from the rest of the world. It's during these winters that our community truly comes together, huddling for warmth not just physically, but emotionally. Growing up here, I always felt safe, protected by the watchful eyes of neighbors and the strong presence of my grandfather. Richard Harris is something of a legend in our town. At 68 years old, he stands as tall and proud as he did in his days as a Marine. His weathered face tells stories of battles fought and won, both on foreign shores and right here at home. To most, he's a pillar of the community, the kind of man you can always count on in a crisis. To me, he's been so much more. A father figure, a confidant, and my rock in the stormy seas of life. I remember the day my mother died as if it were yesterday. I was only 7 years old, a little girl with pigtails and scraped knees, suddenly facing a world without the warm embrace of my mom. My father, always more comfortable in airport lounges than in our family home, retreated further into his work, leaving me adrift in a sea of grief. It was Grandpa Richard who stepped in, his strong hands catching me before I could fall too far. He taught me how to fish in the nearby lake, how to change a tire, and most importantly, how to stand tall in the face of adversity. "Life's gonna throw you curveballs, kiddo," he'd say, his eyes twinkling with a mix of wisdom and mischief. "But it's how you swing that matters." Those words echoed in my mind as I packed up my dorm room 3 months ago, my heart shattered into a million pieces. I thought I had found the love of my life in college, a whirlwind romance that swept me off my feet and then dropped me from a great height. The breakup was messy, painful, and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about myself and the world. With nowhere else to turn, I came home to the one place I knew I'd be safe, Grandpa Richard's house. At first, it felt like stepping back in time. The old Victorian house on the outskirts of town hadn't changed a bit. The creaky porch swing still swayed in the breeze. The flower beds my grandmother had lovingly tended years ago still bloomed with vibrant colors, and the smell of Grandpa's famous chowder still wafted from the kitchen. It was comforting, like slipping on a well-worn sweater on a chilly autumn day. Grandpa welcomed me with open arms, his bare hug enveloping me in a cocoon of safety I hadn't realized I'd been missing. "Welcome home, sweetheart," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "You stay as long as you need." And just like that, I was a little girl again, seeking solace in the one person who had never let me down. The first few weeks passed in a blur of tears and long conversations. Grandpa listened patiently as I poured out my heart, never judging, always offering a shoulder to cry on or a word of encouragement when I needed it most. We fell into a comfortable routine. Morning walks along the beach, afternoons spent working in his woodshop or tending to the garden, and evenings curled up by the fireplace, sharing stories and dreams. It was during one of these evenings that I first noticed something had changed. We were sitting closer than usual, the flickering firelight casting dancing shadows across the room. Grandpa was regaling me with tales from his Marine days, his eyes alight with the memories of adventures long past. As I laughed at a particularly funny anecdote, I caught him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. It was tender, yes, but there was something else there. Something that made my heart skip a beat in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. I brushed it off at first, chalking it up to my imagination or perhaps the lingering effects of my emotional turmoil. But as the days went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. The casual touches that had once been so innocent, a hand on my shoulder, a quick hug goodbye, now seemed charged with an electricity that both excited and confused me. It wasn't just me who noticed the change. I began to catch whispers and sidelong glances from neighbors when Grandpa and I would go into town for groceries or to attend community events. Mrs. Johnson, who had known me since I was in diapers, cornered me one day at the local diner. "It's so nice to see you and your grandfather so close," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But don't you think it's time you started looking for a job, dear? A young woman like you shouldn't be so dependent." Her words stung more than I cared to admit. Was that how people saw me now? As some sort of freeloader, taking advantage of my grandfather's kindness? The thought made me sick to my stomach. But even as I tried to distance myself, to prove to everyone and myself that I was capable of standing on my own 2 feet, I found myself drawn back to Grandpa Richard like a moth to a flame. It was during a particularly fierce autumn storm that things came to a head. The wind howled outside, rain lashing against the windows as if trying to break in. The power had gone out hours ago, leaving us huddled together in the living room, surrounded by the warm glow of candles. Grandpa was telling me about my grandmother, how they had weathered storms just like this one in their early days of marriage. "She was the bravest woman I ever knew," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Stubborn as a mule, but with a heart of gold. You remind me of her sometimes, Lisa." I looked up at him, startled by the intensity in his gaze. In that moment, illuminated by candlelight, he didn't look like the grandfather I had known all my life. He looked like a man, strong, vulnerable, and achingly human. Without thinking, I leaned in closer, drawn by a force I couldn't name or resist. Our lips met in a kiss that was both shocking and inevitable. It lasted only a second, maybe 2, but in that brief moment, the world as I knew it shattered and reformed. We pulled apart, both of us gasping as if we'd been underwater and had just come up for air. "Lisa," Grandpa whispered, his voice a mix of desire and despair. "We can't." But even as he said the words, his hand cupped my cheek, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a tenderness that made me ache. I knew he was right. I knew that what we were feeling, what we had done, was wrong on so many levels. And yet, in that moment, nothing had ever felt more right. The storm raged on outside, but it was nothing compared to the tempest brewing within me. Years of love, trust, and familial bonds warred against this new, forbidden desire. I thought of the town, of what people would say if they knew. I thought of my father, so distant and yet still a presence in our lives. I thought of my mother, looking down on us from wherever she was. What would she think of her daughter and her father finding solace in each other's arms? As the night wore on, Grandpa and I talked. We cried. We held each other at arm's length, fighting against the magnetic pull that threatened to bring us together again. By the time dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, we had come to a decision. What had happened was a mistake, a moment of weakness born from grief, loneliness, and a lifetime of deep affection twisted by circumstance. We agreed to never speak of it again, to bury the memory deep and move forward as we always had, as grandfather and granddaughter, nothing more and nothing less. But even as we made our pact, I could see in Grandpa's eyes the same knowledge that burned in my heart. Things would never truly be the same again. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into job hunting with a fervor that surprised even me. I needed to prove to myself, to Grandpa, to the whole town that I was capable of standing on my own 2 feet. I needed to put distance between us, both physically and emotionally, before the tenuous control we had established could slip away. As I sit here now, watching the sun set over the ocean, I can't help but wonder about the nature of love, of family, of the lines we draw and the ones we cross. I know that what happened between Grandpa and me was wrong, a taboo that society rightfully condemns. And yet I can't bring myself to regret it entirely. That moment, as misguided as it was, taught me something about the complexity of human emotions, about the way love can twist and change and surprise us. I've accepted a job offer in a city 3 hours away. It's not my dream job, but it's a start, a chance to build a life that's truly my own. Grandpa helped me pack my car this morning, his movements stiff, his eyes avoiding mine. As I hugged him goodbye, I felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. "I'm proud of you, kiddo," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "You're gonna do great things." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I drove away, watching his figure grow smaller in my rearview mirror, I felt a chapter of my life closing. The road ahead is uncertain, full of twists and turns I can't yet see. But I'm ready to face it, armed with the strength and resilience that Grandpa Richard taught me, tempered by the knowledge that love, in all its forms, is both beautiful and dangerous. As I leave our little coastal town behind, I carry with me the lessons of the past and the hope for the future. The wind whips through my open windows, carrying the scent of salt and possibility. I don't know what lies ahead, but I know that whatever comes, I'll face it head-on, just like Grandpa taught me. After all, life's gonna throw you curveballs, but it's how you swing that matters. The summer storm that hit our coastal town that afternoon seemed to mirror the turbulence brewing inside me. As the rain lashed against the windows and thunder rumbled ominously in the distance, I found myself alone in the house with Grandpa Richard. The power had gone out, plunging us into a dim, shadowy world that felt both familiar and alien. I was curled up on the couch, trying to lose myself in a book, when Grandpa's voice cut through the sound of the rain. "Lisa, sweetheart, why don't you come sit closer to me? It's getting chilly in here." His tone was gentle, concerned, but something in it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I looked up to see him patting the seat next to him, a smile on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. Reluctantly, I moved closer, telling myself I was being silly, that this was just Grandpa being his usual protective self. But as I settled beside him, his arm draped over my shoulders, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. "You know, Lisa," he began, his voice low and intimate, "I've been worried about you lately. A young woman like you shouldn't be cooped up in this old house all the time. You should be out there, living your life, finding someone special." His hand moved from my shoulder to my hair, stroking it in a way that once would have been comforting but now felt unsettling. "But then again," he continued, "it's a cruel world out there. People don't understand you like I do. They can't take care of you the way I can." I felt my body tense, my mind racing to make sense of what was happening. Was I reading too much into his words, his touch? Was this just my own emotional turmoil clouding my judgment? I tried to laugh it off, to steer the conversation to safer ground, but Grandpa seemed determined to keep us on this uncomfortable path. As the storm raged on outside, I found myself trapped in a different kind of tempest, one of confusion, fear, and a growing sense of betrayal. The next morning, I woke up early, my mind made up. I needed to get out of the house, to put some distance between myself and Grandpa, to clear my head and try to make sense of what was happening. I left a note saying I was going to visit my childhood friend Megan, and practically ran out the door before Grandpa could wake up and try to stop me. The walk to Megan's house was both familiar and strange. The town looked the same as it always had. The same quaint shops, the same well-manicured lawns, the same friendly faces nodding hello as I passed. But I felt like a stranger in my own skin, carrying a secret that threatened to burst out of me with every step. Megan greeted me with a warm hug and a concerned look. We'd been friends since kindergarten, and she could always tell when something was bothering me. As we settled into her cozy living room, mugs of steaming coffee in hand, she fixed me with a piercing gaze. "All right, spill it," she said. "What's going on with you? You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth, ready to let everything pour out. The uncomfortable moments with Grandpa, the growing tension in the house, the confusion and fear that had taken root in my heart. But as I tried to form the words, I found myself stumbling, unable to articulate exactly what was wrong. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? "It's Grandpa," I finally managed to say. "Things have been weird lately. He's been saying things, doing things. I don't know, Meg. Maybe I'm just overreacting." Megan's brow furrowed as she listened. I could see the concern in her eyes, mixed with a growing unease. "What kind of things, Lisa?" she pressed gently. Has he touched you inappropriately?" The directness of her question hit me like a slap. Had he? I thought back to his hand in my hair, his arm around my shoulders. Nothing overtly inappropriate. And yet, "No," I said quickly, then hesitated. "I mean, not really. It's more the way he looks at me sometimes, the things he says. It's like he's trying to keep me dependent on him, isolated from everyone else." Megan set her coffee down and took my hands in hers. "Lisa, honey, this sounds serious. Have you talked to your dad about this?" The mere thought of discussing this with my father made my stomach churn. Peter Harris had always been a distant figure in my life, more comfortable in boardrooms than in family gatherings. How could I possibly broach the subject with him? I shook my head, fighting back tears. "I can't, Meg. He wouldn't understand. He'd probably think I was making it all up." We spent the rest of the day together, Megan doing her best to distract me with old movies and junk food, just like when we were kids. But as the sun began to set, I knew I couldn't avoid going home any longer. Megan hugged me tightly before I left, making me promise to call her if things got worse. As I walked back home, I felt a mix of dread and determination. I needed to find a way to address the situation, to set boundaries with Grandpa without destroying our relationship entirely. But as I approached our house, I saw Grandpa waiting for me on the porch, his face a mask of concern and something else I couldn't quite identify. "There you are, sweetheart," he called out as I approached. I was starting to worry. "You know it's not safe for you to be out alone after dark." His words, once comforting, now felt like chains trying to bind me. "I'm 22 years old, Grandpa," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can take care of myself." A shadow passed over his face, quickly replaced by a gentle smile. "Of course you can, Lisa. I just worry, that's all. No one knows you like I do, remember? No one can protect you like I can." As we went inside, Grandpa began reminiscing about the past, about how he'd taught me to ride a bike, how he'd been there for my first heartbreak, how we'd always been there for each other. With each memory, I felt myself being pulled back into the warm, safe cocoon of our relationship, the uncomfortable feelings from earlier beginning to fade. But even as I relaxed, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that this wasn't right, that Grandpa was manipulating me, using our shared history to keep me close. The next few days passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. I found myself alternating between seeking Grandpa's company and avoiding him entirely. Every interaction felt charged with an undercurrent of tension that I couldn't shake. It all came to a head at our monthly family dinner. As we all gathered around the table, Grandpa, my father Peter, Aunt Sarah and her husband, cousins, I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of my secret. The conversation flowed around me, but I barely heard a word, too caught up in my own tumultuous thoughts. It wasn't until I felt my father's hand on my arm that I realized he'd been trying to get my attention. "Lisa, are you all right?" Peter asked, his brow furrowed in concern. "You've barely touched your food." I looked up to see everyone staring at me, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity. Grandpa's eyes bore into me from across the table, a silent warning that made my skin crawl. In that moment, something inside me snapped. "No," I heard myself say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "No, I'm not all right." The table fell silent, all eyes on me. I could feel Grandpa's gaze burning into me, but I couldn't stop now. The words tumbled out of me in a rush, a jumbled confession of discomfort, fear, and confusion. I told them about Grandpa's strange behavior, about the uncomfortable comments and touches, about the way he seemed determined to keep me isolated and dependent on him. As I spoke, I watched the faces around the table change. Shock, disbelief, and horror flickered across their features. My father's face had gone pale, his eyes darting between me and Grandpa as if trying to reconcile two completely different realities. Aunt Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, while her husband sat frozen, fork suspended halfway to his mouth. My cousins exchanged wide-eyed glances, clearly unsure how to react. But it was Grandpa's face that haunted me the most. As I spoke, I watched his expression morph from shock to hurt to something darker, more dangerous. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched, and for a moment, I saw a stranger sitting in my grandfather's place. When I finally fell silent, the tension in the room was palpable. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, to my surprise and dismay, it was my father who broke the silence. "Lisa," he said, his voice strained, "are you sure you're not misinterpreting things? Your grandfather has always been affectionate, you know that. And after everything you've been through lately, well, it's understandable that you might be a bit sensitive." I felt as if I'd been slapped. Of all the reactions I'd anticipated, denial from my own father hadn't been one of them. "Peter," Aunt Sarah interjected, her voice shaky, "you can't just dismiss this. If Lisa says something's wrong, nothing's wrong." Grandpa's voice boomed out, silencing everyone. He stood up slowly, his imposing figure dominating the room. "Lisa's been through a lot, and she's confused. I've only ever tried to take care of her, to protect her. If she's misunderstood my intentions, well, that's unfortunate, but I won't sit here and be accused of." He trailed off, his face a mask of righteous indignation. The room erupted into chaos. Voices raised in argument. Accusations flew back and forth. I sat there, frozen, watching as my family tore itself apart around me. My cousin slipped away, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. Aunt Sarah was in tears, her husband trying to calm her down while simultaneously defending Grandpa. And my father sat there, his head in his hands, looking lost and overwhelmed. As the arguments raged on, I felt a strange sense of detachment wash over me. I'd finally spoken my truth, brought my fears and suspicions into the light. And this was the result: denial, anger, and a family fracturing before my eyes. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. All eyes turned to me once again. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." And with that, I fled the room, ran out of the house, and into the cool night air. As I stood there on the front lawn, gulping in deep breaths of salty sea air, I heard the front door open behind me. I turned, half expecting, half fearing, to see Grandpa. But it was my father who approached, his face etched with lines of worry and confusion. "Lisa," he began, his voice hesitant. "I don't know what to think. Your grandfather, he's always been..." He trailed off, seemingly at a loss for words. I looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. I saw the gray in his hair, the bags under his eyes, the weight of responsibility and guilt that seemed to hang on his shoulders. In that moment, I realized that he was just as lost as I was, just as unsure of how to navigate this treacherous new reality we found ourselves in. "Dad," I said softly, "I know it's hard to believe. I didn't want to believe it myself. But something's wrong and I don't know how to fix it." Peter nodded slowly, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I hear you, Lisa. I do. I need time to process this, to figure out what to do next. Can you give me that?" I nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As we stood there in the moonlight, the sounds of continued argument drifting out from the house behind us, I felt a shift in our relationship. For the first time in my life, my father was seeing me not as a child to be protected, but as an adult with valid concerns and fears. It was a small step, but an important one. The road ahead would be difficult, I knew. There would be more arguments, more denial, more painful conversations. The comfortable family dynamic we'd known for so long was forever changed. But as I stood there with my father, I felt a spark of strength ignite within me. I had spoken my truth, and even if not everyone believed me yet, I had taken the first step towards reclaiming my life and my autonomy. Whatever came next, I would face it head-on, no longer a silent victim but a woman determined to write her own story. As we turned to go back inside, to face the storm that awaited us, I took a deep breath and squared my shoulders. The journey ahead would be hard, but for the first time in months, I felt ready to face it. The truth, once spoken, could not be unheard, and in that truth lay the seeds of my liberation. The weight of the past few days hung heavy on my shoulders as I made my way down the familiar path to our family's old fishing cabin. The air was thick with the scent of pine and salt, a combination that had once brought me comfort but now only served to heighten my anxiety. I knew what I had to do, but that didn't make it any easier. The confrontation I'd been avoiding for so long was finally at hand, and there was no turning back now. As the cabin came into view, my steps faltered. I could see Grandpa Richard through the window, his silhouette framed by the setting sun. He was sitting in his favorite chair, the one he'd always claimed had the best view of the lake. How many times had I sat at his feet in that very spot, listening to his stories and basking in the warmth of his affection. The memory of those simpler times threatened to weaken my resolve, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't afford to let nostalgia cloud my judgment, not now. Taking a deep breath, I stepped onto the creaky porch and knocked on the door. "Come in, Lisa," Grandpa's voice called out, warm and inviting as ever. "I've been expecting you." Of course he had. Grandpa Richard always seemed to know everything, always one step ahead. As I entered the cabin, the familiar scent of wood smoke and old books enveloped me. Grandpa turned to face me, a gentle smile on his weathered face. "Sit down, sweetheart," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "We need to talk, don't we?" I remained standing, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "Yes, we do," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Grandpa, we need to talk about what's been happening between us. His smile faltered for a moment. A flicker of something, fear, anger, passing across his face before the mask of grandfatherly concern slipped back into place. What do you mean, Lisa? Nothing's happening between us. We're family, that's all. I shook my head, frustration building inside me. Don't do that, Grandpa. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. The way you've been acting. The things you've been saying, it's not right. Grandpa leaned forward in his chair, his blue eyes, so like my own, fixed intently on my face. Lisa, honey, I think you might be misunderstanding things. Everything I've done, everything I've ever said or done, has been to protect you. You know that, don't you? His words, once so comforting, now felt like poison in my ears. Protect me, I repeated, my voice rising. Is that what you call it? The way you touch me? The things you say when we're alone, that's not protection, Grandpa. That's abuse. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and accusatory. Grandpa's face darkened, his jaw clenching. Abuse! He spat out the word as if it tasted foul. How dare you? After everything I've done for you, everything I've sacrificed, Dash. Stop it. I shouted, surprising even myself with the force of my outburst. Just stop. I'm not a little girl anymore, Grandpa. I see what you've been doing, how you've been manipulating me all these years. It stops now. For a moment, silence reigned in the cabin. I could hear the gentle lapping of waves against the shore outside, the distant call of a loon. Then, slowly, Grandpa stood up. He seemed to tower over me, his presence filling the small space. Lisa, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Think very carefully about what you're saying. Do you have any idea what these accusations would do to our family? To your father? To everyone who loves and respects me? I felt my resolve wavering under the weight of his words. The thought of tearing my family apart, of being the cause of so much pain and upheaval, made me feel sick to my stomach. But then I remembered the fear, the confusion, the sense of violation I'd been living with for so long. I couldn't back down now. I don't want to hurt anyone, I said, my voice trembling. But I can't keep living like this. It's not right, Grandpa. Deep down, you know it's not right. Something shifted in Grandpa's eyes then, a coldness creeping in that I'd never seen before. He took a step towards me, his hand outstretched. Lisa, you need to listen to me. You're confused. You're upset about that boy who broke your heart. You're imagining things that aren't there. Let me help you, sweetheart. Let me take care of you like I always have. As his hand neared my face, something inside me snapped. All the fear, all the anger, all the confusion of the past months, years, really, came rushing to the surface. Without thinking, I shoved him away from me hard. Time seemed to slow down as I watched Grandpa stumble backwards. His eyes widened in surprise, his arms windmilling as he tried to regain his balance. But it was too late. He fell, his head striking the corner of the old stone fireplace with a sickening crack. Then silence. For a moment, I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Then reality came crashing back, and I rushed to Grandpa's side. Grandpa, I called, my voice high and panicky. Grandpa, can you hear me? There was no response. A thin trickle of blood was seeping from where his head had struck the stone. With shaking hands, I felt for a pulse, praying to a god I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Nothing. No rise and fall of his chest. No flutter of a heartbeat beneath my fingers. Just stillness. A scream built up inside me, threatening to tear its way out of my throat. But I swallowed it down, knowing that if I started screaming now, I might never stop. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It was an accident, I told myself. I was defending myself. He fell. I didn't mean to. But even as these thoughts swirled through my head, another voice whispered insidiously. Who will believe you? You're alone out here. No witnesses. Just the troubled granddaughter and her poor, defenseless grandfather. They'll say you killed him in cold blood. As the implications of what had happened began to sink in, panic overtook me. I had to get out of here. I had to run. Without a backward glance, I fled from the cabin, my feet carrying me swiftly down the path towards home. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like grasping fingers, trying to hold me back. But I ran on, driven by fear and adrenaline. By the time I burst out of the woods and onto the familiar streets of our town, I was gasping for breath, my lungs burning. But I couldn't stop. I had to get home, had to figure out what to do next. As I approached our house, I saw lights on inside. My father's car was in the driveway. For a moment, I hesitated. Should I go in? Should I tell him what had happened? But the thought of facing him, of trying to explain the unexplainable, was too much to bear. Instead, I crept around to the back of the house and slipped in through my bedroom window, just like I used to do as a teenager sneaking in past curfew. Once inside the safety of my room, the full weight of what had happened came crashing down on me. I sank to the floor, my back against the door, and finally allowed the tears to come. They flowed hot and fast, accompanied by great, heaving sobs that shook my entire body. What had I done? How had things gone so terribly, horribly wrong? As I sat there, lost in my grief and fear, I heard my father moving around downstairs. The sound of his footsteps, so familiar and yet now so threatening, sent a fresh wave of panic through me. What would he say when he found out? Would he believe me if I told him the truth? Or would he see me as a monster, a killer? The thought was almost too much to bear. I knew I couldn't stay here. Sooner or later, someone would go to the cabin and find Grandpa. Questions would be asked, suspicions raised. And once the truth came out, or whatever version of the truth people chose to believe, my life as I knew it would be over. With shaking hands, I began to throw clothes into a backpack. I didn't know where I was going or what I would do, but I knew I couldn't stay here. As I packed, my mind raced through possible destinations, people who might help me. But with each name that came to mind, I immediately dismissed it. How could I involve anyone else in this nightmare? How could I ask them to harbor a what? A murderer? An abused granddaughter acting in self-defense? I didn't even know how to define myself anymore. As I zipped up my backpack, my eyes fell on a framed photo on my dresser. It was a picture of me and Grandpa, taken just last summer. We were standing on the deck of his boat, both of us grinning widely, the sun glinting off the water behind us. We looked so happy, so normal. How had we gone from that to this? I picked up the photo, intending to smash it against the wall. But at the last moment, I couldn't do it. Instead, I gently placed it face down in my drawer. I couldn't bear to look at it, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy it either. It was a reminder of the complexity of my feelings, of the love and fear and anger all tangled up inside me. With one last look around my room, the place that had been my sanctuary for so long, now feeling like a prison, I shouldered my backpack and crept back to the window. As I was about to climb out, I heard my father's voice calling up the stairs. "Lisa, are you home?" I thought I heard something. I froze, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he must be able to hear it. For a moment, I was tempted to answer, to run downstairs and throw myself into his arms, to confess everything and beg for his help. But the moment passed, and I slipped out into the night, leaving behind everything I'd ever known. As I made my way through the darkened streets of our town, I felt like a ghost, invisible and insubstantial. The familiar sights, the diner where I'd had my first job, the park where I'd learned to ride a bike, the school where I'd spent so many years, all seemed to belong to another life, another Lisa. The Lisa who existed now was a stranger, even to herself. I had no real plan, no destination in mind. All I knew was that I had to get as far away from here as possible. As I reached the town limits, I stuck out my thumb, praying that someone would stop. It was dangerous, I knew, but no more dangerous than staying here. As headlights appeared in the distance, growing larger as they approached, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Whatever happened next, wherever this road took me, I knew that my old life was over. The girl who had lived in that house, who had loved and trusted her grandfather, who had believed in the safety and security of family, that girl was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone harder and more wary, someone who understood that the world was not the safe, simple place she'd once believed it to be. As a truck slowed to a stop beside me, the driver leaning out to ask where I was headed, I took one last look back at the town that had been my whole world for 22 years. "Anywhere," I said, climbing into the passenger seat. "Anywhere but here." As the truck pulled away, carrying me into an uncertain future, I felt a mix of terror and exhilaration. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew that whatever it was, I would face it on my own terms. The road stretched out before me, dark and full of possibility. And as the lights of my hometown faded in the rearview mirror, I allowed myself one last thought of Grandpa Richard, of the complex tangle of love and fear and resentment he represented. Then I pushed the thought away, turned my face to the wind rushing in through the open window, and looked ahead to whatever the night might bring. The morning dawned cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for the storm that was about to break over our small coastal town. I'd spent the night huddled in a cheap motel room on the outskirts of the next town over, my mind racing with thoughts of what I'd done and what would happen next. I'd barely slept, jumping at every sound, half expecting to hear police sirens at any moment. But as the pale light of dawn crept through the threadbare curtains, I realized I couldn't run forever. I had to face what I'd done, one way or another. With shaking hands, I turned on the small TV in the corner of the room, dreading what I might see. It didn't take long for my worst fears to be confirmed. The local news was leading with a breaking story. The body of Richard Harris, respected community leader and decorated veteran, had been found near the lake by early morning fishermen. My breath caught in my throat as I watched footage of police cars and ambulances surrounding the area I'd fled from just hours before. The reporter's voice droned on about the shock and sadness rippling through the community, but I could barely hear her over the pounding of my heart. What had I done? As I sat there, paralyzed by fear and guilt, my phone buzzed insistently. I turned it off last night in a panic, not wanting to be traced, but in my exhaustion, I must have switched it back on without thinking. The screen was filled with missed calls and messages from my dad, from Aunt Sarah, from friends and neighbors. But it was the most recent message that caught my eye. It was from Megan, and it was short and to the point. "Lisa, where are you? Please call me. It's important." My finger hovered over the call button. Megan had always been my rock, the one person I could count on no matter what. But could I trust her with this? Could I trust anyone? Before I could make a decision, another news update flashed across the TV screen. The police were treating Grandpa Richard's death as suspicious and were appealing for witnesses. They mentioned that they were particularly interested in speaking to his granddaughter, me, who was believed to have been the last person to see him alive. The walls of the small motel room seemed to close in around me. I couldn't stay here, couldn't keep running. With trembling fingers, I dialed Megan's number. She answered on the first ring. "Lisa! Oh my God, Lisa! Where are you? Are you okay?" Her voice, filled with concern and a hint of fear, nearly broke me. "Meg!" I choked out. "I need help. Can you come get me?" I gave her the address of the motel, and she promised to be there as soon as she could. As I waited, I paced the small room, my mind racing. Should I turn myself in? Try to explain what had happened? But how could I make anyone understand the years of subtle manipulation, the growing discomfort, the moment of panic that had led to what? An accident? A crime? I didn't even know how to categorize what had happened anymore. When Megan arrived, her face pale with worry, I broke down completely. Through my tears, I told her everything. The uncomfortable moments with Grandpa, the confrontation at the cabin, the push that had ended in tragedy. Megan listened in stunned silence, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. When I finished, she pulled me into a tight hug, her own tears mingling with mine. "Oh, Lisa," she whispered. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? We could have. I don't know. We could have done something." I shook my head, pulling away from her embrace. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't even understand it myself until it was too late. Megan took a deep breath, visibly steeling herself. "Lisa, you need to go to the police. You need to tell them what happened." The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through me. "I can't, Meg. They'll never believe me. They'll think I murdered him in cold blood." "They might," Megan admitted. "But it's better than running. Lisa, you're not a murderer. It was an accident. But the longer you hide, the worse it's going to look." Deep down, I knew she was right. But the thought of facing my family, the town, the police, it was almost too much to bear. "Will you come with me?" I asked, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. Megan nodded without hesitation. "Of course. I'll be with you every step of the way." The drive back to town was the longest of my life. Every mile brought us closer to a reckoning I wasn't sure I was ready to face. As we approached the familiar streets, I could see that the town was in a state of subdued chaos. People were gathered in small groups, talking in hushed voices. The police station was a hive of activity. Megan parked across the street, and for a long moment, we just sat there watching. "Are you ready?" she asked gently. I wasn't. I didn't think I'd ever be ready, but I nodded anyway. As we walked into the police station, all eyes turned to us. I heard whispers, saw fingers pointing. Detective Sarah Lawson, who I'd known since I was a kid, approached us with a mixture of relief and wariness on her face. "Lisa," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "we've been looking for you. We need to ask you some questions about your grandfather." I took a deep breath, squeezing Megan's hand for support. "I know," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm here to tell you what happened." What followed was the most grueling experience of my life. For hours, I sat in an interrogation room, recounting every detail of my relationship with Grandpa Richard, every uncomfortable moment, every subtle thread. I told them about the confrontation at the cabin, about the push that had ended in tragedy. Detective Lawson listened impassively, her face giving nothing away. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, studying me intently. "Lisa," she said finally, "these are very serious allegations. You understand that, don't you?" I nodded, feeling numb. "I know, but it's the truth. I swear it's the truth." Detective Lawson sighed heavily. "We'll need to corroborate your story, and given the nature of the incident, we'll have to hold you while we investigate further." I nodded again, too exhausted to argue. As they led me to a holding cell, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a window. I barely recognized the pale, haunted face staring back at me. How had I gone from a normal college graduate to this? The next few days passed in a blur of questioning, statements, and sleepless nights. My father came to see me, his face a mask of confusion and pain. "Lisa," he said, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come to me?" I couldn't meet his eyes. "Would you have believed me, Dad? Really?" His silence was answer enough. As the investigation progressed, more and more details came to light. Other women came forward, distant cousins, family friends, all with similar stories of uncomfortable encounters with Grandpa Richard. Old rumors that had been dismissed for years were suddenly being re-examined. The image of the respected community leader began to crumble, revealing a darker, more complex picture beneath. The town was in turmoil. Some people rallied to support me, believing my story and expressing outrage at what I'd been through. Others stood firmly behind Grandpa Richard's memory, refusing to believe that the man they'd known and respected could have been capable of such things. Families were torn apart, friendships strained. The idyllic coastal community I'd grown up in would never be the same. As more evidence came to light supporting my story, the charges against me were reduced. The prosecutors, taking into account the years of abuse and the circumstances of the incident, decided to pursue a case of involuntary manslaughter rather than murder. It was small comfort, but it was something. The trial, when it finally came, was a media circus. Reporters from all over the country descended on our small town, eager to cover the salacious story of the respected elder's dark secrets and his granddaughter's desperate act. I sat through it all in a daze, barely able to believe that this was my life now. As I listened to the testimonies from family members, from experts, from other victims, I felt a strange mix of vindication and despair. Yes, people were finally seeing the truth about Grandpa Richard, but at what cost? The day the verdict was announced, I stood in the courtroom, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. As the judge read out the decision, guilty of involuntary manslaughter, with a sentence of 5 years, possibility of parole after 3, I felt nothing. No relief, no anger, no fear. Just a profound emptiness. As they led me out of the courtroom, I caught sight of my father in the gallery. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and in that instant, I saw all the pain, the regret, the love that he couldn't express in words. I wanted to run to him, to be that little girl again who believed her daddy could fix anything. But that little girl was gone, lost somewhere in the twisted path that had led me here. As the doors of the prison van closed behind me, I leaned my head against the cool metal and closed my eyes. 5 years. 5 years to think about what had happened, to try to make sense of it all. 5 years to figure out who I was now, who I could be when this was all over. The van started moving, carrying me away from everything I'd ever known. But as we drove out of town, Passing the familiar streets and buildings that had been the backdrop of my life, I felt a strange sense of not peace, exactly, but acceptance. Whatever happened next, I would face it. I would survive it. And maybe, just maybe, I would find a way to rebuild my life from the ashes of what had been destroyed. As the town faded from view in the rearview mirror, I allowed myself one last thought of Grandpa Richard. Not the monster he'd become in my mind, nor the saint the town had believed him to be, but the complex, flawed human being he truly was. And as I whispered a final goodbye to him, to my old life, to the person I used to be, I felt something inside me shift. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time since that fateful day at the cabin, I felt ready to face it. Whatever came next, I would meet it head-on, carrying with me the hard-won wisdom of my experiences and the hope for a future that, while different from anything I'd ever imagined, was still mine to shape. The days following my confession blurred together in a haze of police interviews, hushed family conversations, and sleepless nights. I felt like I was living in a bubble, separated from the rest of the world by an invisible barrier of guilt, grief, and confusion. When Detective Lawson finally called us in to announce that the investigation was being closed, treating Grandpa Richard's death as an accidental fall, I felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Part of me wanted to scream the truth from the rooftops, to make everyone understand what had really happened, what had been happening for years. But another part of me, the part that still cringed at the memory of Grandpa's body lying so still by the lake, was grateful for the official story. It gave me a shield to hide behind, a way to avoid the piercing stares and whispered accusations that I knew would come if the whole truth came out. But even as the police closed their files, the rumor mill in our small town was just getting started. I could feel the weight of people's stares whenever I ventured out of the house, could hear the sudden hush fall over conversations as I walked by. Some looked at me with pity, others with suspicion, and a few with outright hostility. It seemed that everyone had their own theory about what had really happened that day at the cabin, and none of them were particularly kind to me or to Grandpa Richard's memory. The worst part, though, was watching my family tear itself apart. The Harrises had always been a tight-knit clan, known for our Sunday dinners and boisterous holiday gatherings. Now, those family events were tense, awkward affairs, with battle lines clearly drawn. Aunt Sarah and her husband stood firmly in my corner, believing my story without question and offering unwavering support. Uncle Tom, on the other hand, refused to hear a word against his father, accusing me of trying to tarnish Grandpa Richard's legacy out of some misplaced sense of resentment or attention-seeking. My cousins were split down the middle, some offering tentative support, others avoiding me entirely. And my father, oh, Dad, he tried so hard to be the peacemaker, to hold the family together, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. He'd aged years in a matter of weeks, his hair graying at the temples, deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. He believed me, I think, or at least he wanted to believe me, but accepting the truth about his father meant confronting his own memories, his own possible complicity in not seeing what was happening right under his nose. I watched him struggle with this internal conflict, and it broke my heart all over again. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself withdrawing more and more from the world around me. The weight of everything that had happened, of the secrets I'd carried for so long, threatened to crush me. It was Dad who finally insisted I see a therapist, gently but firmly steering me towards Dr. Elena Martinez's office one crisp autumn morning. I resisted at first, clinging to the belief that I could handle this on my own, that I was strong enough to push through the pain and confusion. But as I sat in Dr. Martinez's cozy office, surrounded by soft lighting and the gentle ticking of an old grandfather clock, something inside me began to crack. The story poured out of me in fits and starts, a jumbled mess of memories and emotions that I'd been bottling up for years. Dr. Martinez listened patiently, her dark eyes warm and understanding, offering no judgment, no platitudes, just a safe space for me to finally let it all out. Over the weeks and months that followed, Dr. Martinez became my lifeline. With her guidance, I began the painful process of unpacking years of manipulation and abuse, of recognizing the patterns that had shaped my relationship with Grandpa Richard and, by extension, my view of myself and the world around me. It wasn't easy. There were sessions where I raged against the unfairness of it all, screaming and crying until I was hoarse. There were days when I could barely drag myself out of bed, crushed under the weight of guilt and self-loathing. But slowly, painfully, I began to heal. I learned to separate the grandpa Richard I had loved, the one who had taught me to fish and comforted me after nightmares, from the man who had manipulated and abused me. I learned to recognize the ways his actions had shaped my behavior, my relationships, my very sense of self. And hardest of all, I learned to forgive myself. Not for what had happened at the cabin, that Dr. Martinez assured me was a tragic accident born out of years of trauma, but for not speaking up sooner, for not trusting my own instincts, for allowing myself to be silenced for so long. As I worked through my own healing process, I couldn't help but notice the ripple effects spreading through our community. The tragedy that had befallen the Harris family had opened up conversations that had long been considered taboo in our small, close-knit town. Support groups for survivors of abuse sprang up, led by brave individuals who had been inspired to share their own stories. The local high school implemented new programs on healthy relationships and recognizing the signs of emotional manipulation. Even the church, long a bastion of traditional values and swept under the rug secrets, began to address these issues in sermons and youth group meetings. It was a bittersweet realization. On one hand, I was glad that some good was coming out of our family's pain, that others might be spared the years of silent suffering I had endured. On the other hand, it was a stark reminder of how differently things might have turned out if these resources and this openness had existed when I was growing up. As the one-year anniversary of Grandpa Richard's death approached, I found myself at a crossroads. The therapy had helped undoubtedly. I was stronger now, more sure of myself, better equipped to recognize and stand up against manipulation and abuse. But every street corner in this town held a memory, every familiar face a potential judgment. The weight of the past still clung to me like a second skin, threatening to drag me back down into the darkness I'd fought so hard to escape. It was during a particularly intense therapy session that the idea first took root. Dr. Martinez and I were discussing my future, my goals and dreams that had been put on hold in the wake of everything that had happened. "What's stopping you from pursuing those dreams now, Lisa?" she asked gently. I opened my mouth to list off all the reasons: family obligations, community expectations, the lingering shadow of scandal. But the words died on my lips. What was stopping me? The realization hit me like a thunderbolt. Nothing. Nothing was stopping me except my own fear and the chains of the past that I had allowed to bind me. That night, I had a long, tearful conversation with my father. He listened quietly as I poured out my heart, explaining my need for a fresh start, a chance to discover who I could be outside the confines of our family tragedy. When I finished, he pulled me into a tight hug, his voice rough with emotion as he said, "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. So proud of your strength, your resilience. If this is what you need to heal, to grow, then you have my full support." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. I applied to graduate programs in cities far from our small coastal town, wrote countless cover letters for job applications, and slowly began the process of disentangling myself from the web of family obligations and small-town expectations that had defined my life for so long. It wasn't easy. There were tearful goodbyes with Megan and the few other friends who had stood by me through everything. There were tense family dinners where my decision to leave was met with everything from enthusiastic support to bitter accusations of abandonment. There were moments of doubt when the comfort of the familiar, even with all its pain and complexity, seemed preferable to the vast unknown that lay ahead. But through it all, I held on to the vision of a future where I could define myself on my own terms, free from the shadows of the past. The day of my departure dawned bright and clear, a crisp autumn morning that held the promise of new beginnings. As I stood in the driveway, my car packed with the essentials of my new life, I took one last look at the house that had been my home for so long. So many memories, good and bad, were wrapped up in its weathered clapboards and gabled roof. For a moment, I felt a wave of nostalgia, so strong it nearly knocked me off my feet. But then I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the salty sea air, and let it out slowly. This place, this history, would always be a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. As I hugged my father goodbye, both of us trying and failing to hold back tears, I felt a surge of love and gratitude for this man who had struggled so hard to understand, to support me even when it meant confronting painful truths about his own father. "I love you, Dad," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "I'll call as soon as I get settled." He nodded, unable to speak, and gave me one last squeeze before stepping back. As I pulled out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of him in my rearview mirror, standing tall and straight, his hand raised in farewell. The image blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I blinked them away, focusing on the road ahead. The drive out of town was surreal. I passed all the familiar landmarks, the school where I'd spent so many years, the diner where I'd had my first job, the park where Grandpa Richard had taught me to fly a kite. Each sight brought a flood of memories, but for the first time, they didn't threaten to drown me. Instead, they felt like pages in a book I was gently closing, acknowledging their importance but ready to start a new chapter. As I crossed the town line, a strange mix of emotions washed over me. Fear, excitement, sadness, hope. I had no illusions that leaving town would magically erase all the pain and trauma of the past year, or of the years before that. I knew there would still be difficult days ahead, moments when the weight of everything that had happened would threaten to pull me under. But I also knew that I was stronger now, more resilient. I had survived the worst storm of my life, and while I bore scars from the experience, they were proof of my strength, not my weakness. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of possibility leading to a future I could barely imagine. As I pressed down on the accelerator, leaving the familiar coastline behind, I felt a sense of lightness, of freedom, that I hadn't experienced in years. I didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to find out. The tragedy that had befallen my family would always be a part of me, a dark chapter in the story of my life. But it didn't have to be the whole story. As I drove towards my new beginning, I made a silent promise to myself to honor the pain of the past without letting it dictate my future, to carry the lessons I'd learned without being crushed by their weight, and to always trust my own voice. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but I was ready to face it head-on, 1 mile at a time.